Welcome to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, where we talk about historical drama films and series as windows to the past and mirrors of the present. I'm Michonne Boston.
And I'm Tequina Boston. In this podcast, we dive into the feature film, The 6888, with Professor Brenda L. Moore, author of To Serve My Country, to Serve My Race, the story of the only African-American WACS stationed overseas during World War II. The 6888 film and Professor Moore's book tell the story of the first and only Women's Army Corps unit of color to serve overseas during World War II. These unsung heroes were given an extraordinary mission. Despite facing racism and sexism and grueling working conditions, these African-American women, over 800 strong, were committed to serving their country with honor and distinction. Their accomplishments delivered hope to millions of wartime soldiers and their families, and also shattered racial and gender barriers. Written and directed by Tyler Perry, the 6888 film is based on the article Fighting a Two-Front War by Kevin M. Hiemel, published in World War II History magazine in 2022. The film stars Kerry Washington as Major Charity Adams, the commanding officer of the 6888 Central Postal Directory Battalion. Portraying real-life persons from this historical moment in the 1940s are Ebony Obsidian as Corporal Lena Derricott King, Milana Jackson as Captain Abby Noel Campbell, Greg Sulkin as Abram David, Susan Sarandon as First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, Sam Waterston as President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Oprah Winfrey as Mary McLeod Bethune. The film also features an Academy Award-nominated original song written by Diane Warren and performed by her, and choreography by Debbie Allen. The 6888 is available on Netflix.
Joining us for our conversation is Professor Brenda L. Moore, Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminology in the University of Buffalo College of Arts and Sciences in Buffalo, New York. As mentioned in our introduction, Professor Moore is the author of the books To Serve My Country, to Serve My Race, the story of the only African-American WACS stationed overseas during World War II, published by New York University Press in 1996, and Serving Our Country, Japanese American Women in the Military During World War II, published by Rutgers University Press in 2003. Professor Moore completed 3 years of service as a member of the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services, advising the Secretary of Defense on military matters concerning active duty women. From 2016 to 2022, she served as a member of the Veterans Rural Health Advisory Committee, providing advice to the Secretary of Veterans Affairs on health care issues affecting veterans residing in rural areas. In 2023, Professor Moore received the Morris Janowitz Career Achievement Award from the Inter-University Seminar on Armed Forces and Society. Professor Moore was cited for her outstanding contributions to military sociology, her service to the organization's journal and its community of scholars, and her public service addressing issues important to military personnel and veterans. She currently serves on the Inter-University Seminar on Armed Forces and Society's Board of Directors. A complete bio for Professor Brenda L. Moore is available on the webpage for this podcast. Welcome, Professor Moore, to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters.
Oh, thank you. It's so nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
What got you interested in making the history and experiences of Black women and other women of color in the military the focus of your scholarship, research, and writing?
Well, to be really honest, I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago in the 1980s, and I really wasn't writing about history or of course, in doing my studies about civil-military relations, I certainly did look at historical data, but my research really focused on quantitative data. And so I looked at the national longitudinal surveys for my first study, and I was interested in knowing what the effects of the all-volunteer force was on what I referred to as post-service status attainment, what effect did the all-volunteer force have on service members that went in, on their income when they got out, and on their occupations when they got out? And it was a large-scale NLS data. And I stratified the data, separated it by race and by gender. And just to make a long story short, for the most part, what I found is that military service had a positive effect on college enrollment of whites, but a negative effect on college enrollment of blacks. And then when I controlled for race and gender in the models, I found that black women with military experience attained a higher occupational prestige than white women, white men, and black men. So here I was able to see something different that was going on with African American women. And that piqued my interest. And I continue to do quantitative studies. I published an article in 1991 titled African American Women in the Military. And in that, I showed some differences. I've shown, for one thing, that the propensity or the likelihood of African American women to go into the military was greater than other demographics. The title of the article is African American Women in the U.S. Military, published by Armed Forces and Society. While the highest percentage of women went into the Air Force, for African American women, they were largely concentrated in the armies. So I was showing some differences here, and African American women who were in the military were more likely to have at least one dependent child living with them, and were more likely to be single parents. So I was seeing a lot of variation, which really piqued my interest in doing more research on African American women. Now, to make a long story short, I happened to be presenting on a panel, and on that panel was a woman by the name of Elsie Oliver. And Elsie Oliver was a member of the 688. And she and I were sitting next to each other, and she was telling me about her experience in the military during World War II. And she was talking about the role of Mary McLeod Bethune and the role
Yes.
of Eleanor Roosevelt. And I hadn't really known that story. And lo and behold, I realized I need to get away from the numbers, crunching the numbers, and get out here in the field and find out what was going on during World War II with these women who were serving the 688. And that's when I learned how large this unit was. It wasn't a unit, it was a battalion. It's the largest group of women to go overseas during World War II from the WACS. And so that's what got me interested in the historical story. And so I did what an assistant professor would do, wrote a proposal, went before the review board, got approval to go out and do my study, and then I got funding for it. And I went all around the country meeting women who were part of the 688. And that came by going to the archives at first, and then from the archives, finding out names. And some of the names were the same, the names that women had whenever they were in the 688, and then they had whenever I started doing some investigation and locating them. And we did what was called a snowball sample. I interviewed one woman, and she would say, well, such and such a person also has some experience, and I've been in touch with her, and you might want to talk to her. And it snowballed into 51 women that I was able to interview, not just one time, but to do multiple interviews to find out about their experience in the military during World War II. Fascinating story. I was in awe through the whole process.
I bet they were really thrilled to have someone come to them and say, I want to know that story.
Yeah, yeah.
They were very welcoming. In the movie, there was the executive officer, Abby Noel Campbell, that's featured in that movie. I interviewed her multiple times. I went down to Tuskegee to interview her, and I can remember being on the phone with her introducing my project and asking her for some days that would be convenient for me to come down and visit and to interview her. And she said, "Well, let me know when you're coming down. I'll pick you up at the airport." And I thought, wow. They were very welcoming. Actually, I rented a car because I was doing some research at Maxwell Air Force Base at the same time. But I had the honor of going to her family house to interview her. And, her family, her father worked as, for the Department of Agriculture, showing people how to plant crops. I don't know if you're familiar with, and some of your listeners may be familiar with a movie that was done, and a play that was done, and a book that was done, Miss Evers' Boys, talking
Yeah.
about the nurse. All right. Well, Miss Evers was part of her family's, friends. They would come to the house and they would also, they would have dinners and what have you. Booker T. Washington, we all know that name, was one of her brother's godfather. So you know where I'm going. So here it is. I'm spending like a week and a half with this woman, and she's sharing this rich information about her upbringing, about the people that I've only read about in textbooks, and how close they were. This was like a community of the Black intelligentsia, I would say. And then, told me about her experience in the military. Just that sort of experience was just fascinating. And the
Yeah.
welcoming, I went to church with her, So this was some real ethnographic studies that I learned about at University of Chicago in the flesh, you
Yeah.
know. So yes, they were very welcoming, and I was more than thrilled to spend the time I spent with each of them.
Professor Moore, for our listeners who aren't familiar with military history, and particularly women in the U.S. military, could you give a brief summary of the history of the Women's Army Corps? Provide a
Mhm.
little context for our listeners.
Well, I think that it's good to start with World War II because World War II actually created a need for large numbers of women to serve in the military, not only in the United States, but around the world. So thousands of women in the United States volunteered for military service. Women in Britain were actually drafted into the military. The Soviet Union assigned women as combatants. And this is because of the large scale World War that was going on, and the need for women. Some 400,000 American women served in a variety of non combatant military jobs. The U.S. Department consulted members of the British Information Service because the British had experience with women in the military. And they talked about how to best establish a Women's Army Auxiliary Corps in the United States. And so the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps in the United States was established in March 1942. Oveta Culp Hobby was appointed the WACS director and given the rank of lieutenant colonel. That was the highest rank that a woman would have in the military during World War II at that time. 30,000 women applied for officer candidate school. Now, you have to be aware of the fact that the military is stratified rank-wise in terms of officers. That's one particular trajectory. And then another one would be enlisted. And so 30,000 women applied for officer candidate school. And most of the women selected had been employed successfully. They were employed in civilian life. They had college training. Some were married, and a few had children. So on July 20th, 1942, 440 women began officer candidate school at Fort Des Moines, Iowa. That was the first WAC training center. 40 of those women were African American, which represented about 10.6% of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps strength, roughly proportionate to Blacks in the total population. Now, the WACS, the Women Army Auxiliary Corps, was one in which women didn't have the same ranks. They didn't have the same, they weren't subjected to the same punishment as men. They were separate. But the following year, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was converted to the Women's Army Corps. And the Women's Army Corps gave women temporary but full military status. And so women who were part of the Women's Army Corps was able to use the GI Bill and to go to school. Prior to that, Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, they were just separate. They weren't really part of the military. And so that gives you a little bit of background. And if one was to say, well, why, women going into the military during that time, it was because of the fact that we were at war and that strength was necessary. It was needed. Because after the war, many of the women who served, large numbers of women who served, and the women who didn't go into the military but were the Rosie the Riveters. Many African American women served as Rosie the Riveters. But at any rate, after the war, all of those opportunities to go in and serve were actually rescinded. And those gains that women had during World War II were sort of dissolved. And it wasn't until after the war that women were given a permanent place in the armed services.
At that time, white women serving in the Women's Army Corps, or WACS, got overseas assignments. But Black women WACS weren't considered for any overseas assignments. How did the 6888 break that barrier to get an assignment in Europe? What were the social, political, and organizational factors that led to their European assignment? I mean, was there anything the film left out in that story
that you think is really important?
That's important.
Yeah. First of all, during World War II, when women were being recruited to go into the military, African American women were being overlooked, to be honest with you. Again, Mary McLeod Bethune wanted the women to have the opportunity to serve their nation, African American women, as did white women. And many women who applied to go into the military, Black women, that is, and I write about this pretty extensively in my book, had to get into letter writing. They applied and they were rejected. They applied, they were rejected. And because of a lot of letter writing and pressure put on the War Department, they began to allow African American women to go in. Well, the same with overseas assignments. Few women went overseas. The first WAC detachment was actually headed by Mary Halloran. And it was a very small unit. That was a white unit of WACs to go overseas during World War II. But for African American women, they weren't getting the assignment to go overseas. Now, you have to realize these women were very patriotic. All of them were. White, Black, Hispanic, Asian. And they wanted to actually do their part in terms of making the nation safe for democracy. This is what they would say. They wanted to make the world safe for democracy. They wanted to do what they could do. Going overseas was something that they felt was important for them to do to support the war effort. But again, African American women were being overlooked. And it took a lot of political pressure from the civilian world. Black newspapers, the Crisis magazine, Black leaders, actually putting pressure on the War Department to develop and establish a unit of Black women to go over. No one knew what it would look like. No one knew what it was, but also realized that this first group of women going over for the 6888 were already in uniform. They were already serving in the military. Many of them were officers. There were like 31 officers that served with the 6888. They were commanders of their units, those women. And of course, the largest number of women, thousands of women, some 4,000 or 5,000 African American women were enlisted.
Mm.
And so out of the group that were already in the military, and it took struggle to get there, there's a section that I talk about this. It says, fight our battles and claim our victories. And I talk about that struggle of African American women to, number one, serve, and number two, to go overseas. And through a lot of that political pressure on the outside, the War Department sort of began to lift its restrictions on African American women and put together this group to sort the mail. So it wasn't just a group that went over. It was a group that went over as a result of social conflict, social pressure, in an effort to give African American women the same opportunities that white women had in our country, the same opportunities to fulfill their citizenship rights or obligation, the same opportunity to be able to receive the benefits that were associated with giving their life to the service for the nation. So during that time, that was a time that a lot of emphasis was given on equality of opportunity. And as you see, I think that was really shown very well in the film. Women were determined, African American women were determined to show that they were capable, and if not just capable, even more so capable than any other woman, that they were going to do their job. And I think what's remarkable is that they did it in face of such opposition. They did it in face of a lot of discouragement. But there was this mission that was broader than just themselves. Number one, to fight for democracy here in the United States, but number two, to fight against totalitarianism, the fight against Nazism, overseas. So it was that double victory that was so popular during that time that they had in mind. That was a big sentiment.
And what made, because that was something that you hear the Kerry Washington as Captain Charity Adams say, you are here to basically, she's telling them, nobody thinks that you can do anything because you're, in that the terminology of the time, Negro, and you're women.
Mm-hmm.
And here they are, it's, the Jim Crow, and they're even at a Southern camp. And yet there's this belief that somehow their service, and the irony of they're fighting totalitarianism across the ocean, and we know the kind of ethnic and racial, it wasn't discrimination. There was actually ethnic genocide and an attempt to create, quote unquote, a superior race, that they were fighting that kind of authoritarianism. And yet at home, they weren't receiving full rights as citizens.
Yeah, I just want to make a note for our listeners. These women were also in segregated sections on the base, Army base. White women were in one section, Black women were in another section, did not sleep together, did not eat together. I think you make that clear in your book, Professor Moore.
Yes.
Yeah.
They were in segregated units. Black men, Black women were served in segregated unit. And then you bring up a very important point, and that point was that during that time, during that period in American history, the attitude and the feeling about Blacks during that time was that they were inferior, genetically inferior to whites. And so there was a big eugenics movement to sort of prove that Blacks were not full people. They only were like 3/5 or a fraction of a human being. All right. And this was something that was now they knew. I mean, Du Bois talks about a double consciousness. Black women, these women knew full well that this is the way our society view us, but this is not who we are. And so this is what they're battling. This pressure, and an environment that's looking at them as being less than human. At the same
Yeah.
time, they realize their worth, and they're going to demonstrate to the world that they're capable of doing that and even more. That all these myths about them are just that, they're myths. And so this whole um, attitude towards Blacks during World War II was that they were less than human. And it wasn't just African American women, it was African American men too. So the women and the men both served in segregated units. That's interesting because of the fact that everybody in the 6 AAA was of mixed heritage. They were defined by the War Department as being colored. Being colored during that time, there was a black-white paradigm. You're either black or you're white, or you're colored or you're white. And the way that manifests itself was in terms of the treatment and the rewards and the punishment. So if you were colored, you were less than. If you were in an ambiguous category like Asian, then some of the people that I interviewed were told during World War II that you are more white than you are black. So, or
Mm.
more white than you are colored. So they weren't to use the colored only water fountain, But this was the paradigm. And all of this is socially constructed. Well, this is nothing biological at all. This was socially constructed. It was based on an economic system that needed free labor, i.e., slaves. And in order to justify slavery in an America, in a system that professed to be a democratic one, that professed to be one that was free, you have to say, well, the people who are slaves that contradicts this notion were not people. So we don't have to really consider them like we considered others. And so you've got this false separation between blacks and whites. And this is what they were battling against. And this is what all black service members, I mean, there were thousands upon thousands of blacks who served during World War II. Not just black women, but black men too.
Huh.
The
And so
number.
given this is the context they're operating in, how did they cope in those circumstances? And in what way did some kind of like change happen both for them, but also when you look at the larger society? Because I one of the things I remember coming out of World War I was Black men who came back had a very different idea of who they were and were much more assertive of their rights because they had served. But what was the impact in terms of the World War II, particularly Black women serving in the military, when they took on and were successful in the roles that they were given?
Right. They weren't really applauded for their work until more recent years. And so they were kind of ignored. The 6 AAA were. They sort of knew within themselves. And that's one of the things that a community does. A community realizes that, well, although you are wrongfully being done wrong by the broader society, we understand that we recognize your worth. All right. And so with the 6 AAA being segregated by gender and segregated by race, they all had a very similar, regardless of how different they were, regardless of how their economic realities were different, regardless of how their religious, differences that they had. They came together because they were all colored and considered less than, and they knew that they were being treated in a very similar way, regardless of what kind of education they had, they were Black. Regardless of, where they grew up, what their parents did. If they were poor, they were still Black. And this external pressure, I call it an external pressure. That external pressure I'm defining as racism. This external pressure that I call racism actually unifies them. And they're able to be supportive of each other. That's how they cope with that. So when you find that these women died in a car accident, for example, and the War Department wasn't going to give them a proper burial, and this is based on a true story. Some of the details are in the movie are not quite accurate, but nonetheless, 3 women did die. And you find the executive officer, Abby Noel Campbell Mitchell, and the battalion commander, Charity Adams, both of whom were friends, by the way, before they even got together and to go overseas to for the 688. But you find that they are actually utilizing the resources within that unit to give these women a proper burial. So someone had skills in mortuary science. Of course, they had skills in terms of how to prepare the body. They had skills in terms of how to have a religious ceremony. All of these things that they put together. And you find that being the case in almost everything they had to do. So they were supportive of each other. And this women that, when I interviewed the women, I interviewed Charity Adams as well as Noel Campbell Mitchell. But when some of the women stayed in, and when they stayed in, they were in a desegregated unit. And I just want to, if I may, just read to you something that Bernice Thompson told me when she was out of the 6888. She stayed in, and she went to a unit. And this just illustrates how when they weren't part of that segregated unit, some of the things that were lost in a desegregated unit after the war was that support, that community, that social support. So this is what Bernice Thompson had to say. She says, she was discharged from the service in California and decided to stay there. I stayed with some friends in Oakland, and I applied for a job in Presidio. She's still in the military, a military installation in San Francisco. After a great deal of dispute about hiring a Black woman, Thomas was engaged to fill a clerical position at Presidio. I was accepted, but I was completely ignored. I was seated in front of a typewriter and no one would talk to me. The other help in the office were all white and they wouldn't give me anything to do. And if they did give me something, it would be just like throwing a dog a bone. Can you see the isolation
Yeah.
and the
Yeah,
lack of support, being isolated? So one of the things that helped the 6888 members actually cope with this this racism that was taking place that they found just about wherever they went was the fact that they were together and they were experiencing it the same way. They could be mutually supportive. The other thing that we cannot forget, and you allude to it when you say the African American men who came back after they were treated much better in Europe, they were emboldened. They were not going to accept being second-class citizens in the United States. Some stayed in Europe. Well, the same with the Black women. The Black women were treated well. That doesn't come out very well in the film. But they were treated well by the British, and they were treated well by the French. And many of them talk about the lifelong friendships that they made. And some of them talked about how American white soldiers would treat them in a negative manner and at a pub, and a British person would come up and say that wasn't accepted there, you see. And so there was more of an acceptance of them as being human beings, as being these beautiful women that they were, in a way that they weren't experiencing from people who were in the same military outfit, in the same military, on the same side of them.
Mhm.
I mean, we're all on the same side. The British were on the same side, and French,
Right.
because we're fighting in support of each other. However, the American soldiers would look at them as being less than. This is how they were conditioned in the United States. This is how they were socialized. And so the myth that came out about tails, that blacks after a certain time, 12 o'clock midnight, they grow tails. Yes, many of the British and the Europeans were curious. Do you grow a tail after
Oh my
after
goodness.
midnight, sort of thing? But that was a myth that was actually spread by white soldiers who were very much against having black people along fighting alongside of them.
Mm. That's interesting because there were Black people in Britain and Black people in France for many centuries.
That's right.
You've been enjoying Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast where we talk about historical drama series and films as windows to the past and mirrors of the present.
Visit our webpage at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters. Share this podcast. Join our historical drama community by signing up for our newsletter to stay up to date on future episodes and bonus content.
Now, back to our podcast conversation.
I want to talk about leadership here, what we see, because I remember when I started the film, I thought, and Kerry Washington comes on the screen as Charity Adams, Major Charity Adams. I'm like, oh boy, is she going to do Louis Gossett and An Officer and a Gentleman?
Yeah.
But it's a different kind of leadership style, a different kind of purpose. I mean, in An Officer and a Gentleman, it was about training officers. That was an individual achievement. But there's a bigger mission here for Major Adams and Captain Abby Noel Campbell to bring these women, up to speed or get them training to do a very important mission. Tell us about these two women as models of leadership. How do they compare, contrast, and what made them able to deal with the racism and sexism in the military as they're going up the rank? And how did they get there?
Yeah. Well, I think that both of them had memoirs. Charity Adams published her memoirs in a book called One Woman's Army. And Noel Campbell Mitchell also has memoirs that explicitly states what they were doing. Her memoir was called A Call to Arms. She has a part 1 and part 2. They're not, her memoir has not been published as yet. But at any rate, they talk about their experiences going through the ranks. Both were in the first class, and they talk about not being respected as young officers, pretty much. Having to, again, to be determined to demonstrate their abilities to do the job and to do the job well. A lot of that, I think, it was instilled in them before they even went into the military. Both of them had their faith. Charity Adams' father was a minister. Noel Campbell Mitchell's was also a woman of faith. And so these are some of the survival techniques that are learned. I mean, we learned it through our community. Part of our community, our being African Americans during that time, was the church. The church played a big role, and also in terms of family. Family played a big role. And so whenever they were in an environment that challenged their worth, sometimes they had to dig down way deep to find support. Sometimes they had to dig down real deep and realize, no, this isn't who I am. This is who I am, and I know this is who I am. And they communicated with their families. Noel Campbell Mitchell talks, and I wish there was more of her biography shown in the film, she talks about she had 3 brothers, 2 sisters. One of her brothers was a medical doctor, and she communicated with them, and he came over to the 6888, and he was actually the medical doctor for the 6888 for a time. So here's a communication. They communicated with Brigadier General Benjamin O. Davis. We know that name,
Yeah.
but they communicated in so you have this community of folks that you don't see, which is very important to the story, but you don't see actually creating a support system for each other. And I think that was invaluable in terms of the role. And of course, they did speak about Mary McLeod Bethune, stating that and reinforcing that you're not doing this for yourself, you're doing this for the race. And so this was instilled in them. But even in addition to Mary McLeod Bethune, this was instilled in the community. This was instilled in the community. When you are out there, this is the way you're being treated, but this is who you are. And I think that there's a lot to be gained from that. I don't see the community so much today as I experienced it when I was growing up. So to give you a little bit of insight, I served in the military in 1973. I went in 1973 and I got out in 1979. I served in Germany from 1976 to 1979. And I could relate to being someplace and being isolated. Not only there are a lot of African American males there, but they're like just hypothetically 8,000 male troops and maybe 6 women.
Wow.
Did not have
Yikes.
feminist products. We did not have feminist products in the post exchange. We didn't have, at that time I had a natural, and it was the ultra sheen time.
Yes.
I couldn't get any of those things over there. That meant that I had to have a care package. And so my mother would send me care packages, so that you have the basic things that you need. You had those things that you needed. It was an environment that was not welcoming. And there was oftentimes I had to dig way down deep to see how I was going to survive it. And there were times I didn't even know if I was coming back home, So I can understand that sometimes you've got to draw from the strengths that you've been socialized with, that you grew up with, particularly when you were out of that environment. And for Abby Noel Campbell Mitchell, she was in Tuskegee. You know what kind of community that was, and in terms of being supportive of being Black. I asked her one time, a little bit aside, but it's kind of relevant. I asked her one time, how did you feel being in the North after being in the, no, I said, when you're in the North, in the South, it was segregated. You had Jim Crow. And so how was that, being in, having Jim Crow, you couldn't sit on the back, you had to sit in the back of the bus, and, the blatant racism that you had experienced growing up. She says, I didn't experience that. She said, no, I never took a bus. If I had to go someplace, my family took me in a car. So what I'm suggesting is this type of support, this type of buffering, to grow strength. So when they were away from that, they were able to dig way down and use it for support. And they supported each other.
Yeah.
Because even if people didn't identify with being Black, they did whenever they were treated that way. And they had to come together and support each other that way. Whenever they were no longer a group and they were isolated, then they became very vulnerable. Some of the women that I spoke to that stayed in.
I'm glad that you brought up Afro Sheen, because one of the themes of this podcast is hair. We always talk about hair. And I just loved in the movie how they set up their own beauty parlor. And it wasn't about beauty. They needed that maintenance. It was about maintenance.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, everybody can't relate to that. Another aside, I teach in Singapore semesters, and usually this time of year I'm in Singapore. But when I first went there in 2011, I had spoke to a colleague of mine. I said, "Well, do you know of any beauty salons? Where can I get my hair done?" And she, not really understanding why that was so important to me, sort of trivialized it. And she said, "Well, I'm white and I'm blonde, and people look at me out like I'm funny." She didn't get it at all. I did happen to find someone who was able to do black hair at a perm, but here again, you take a 688 and all of them share something in common. You don't have to explain that. They know that,
Right. Yeah.
so that within itself creates a support system. Now take them away and put people in different parts of, Europe, and they're isolated. What that creates is a lack of unity. What that creates is a lack of support. What that creates is a lack of reinforcement. Now, I'm not saying that segregation was a good thing, but I'm saying that maybe an unintended consequence was the fact that they were able to be strong as a group. You're stronger in numbers there. And I think you see that when you see that being able to march and travel. And when you're traveling for military, and I can imagine what it was during World War II, and I've read accounts, people wrote in their notes about how it was going over in the ship, and you sort of get a sense of that in the film. But once you get over there, you're exhausted. Probably their legs and ankles were swollen. You can imagine, you can feel it, but they had to march.
Yeah.
And they
That's a
had,
very moving scene.
Yeah.
and they had to do that. And that means they had to go outside themselves. This is something bigger than we are. And they did. They came together and they supported. They revered. They revered their commander. They revered. They would tell me she had beauty. She had brains. They had reunions. The 6888 members actually started a group of African American women's service women, and it has another name now, but it was started by 6888 members, and I used to attend their reunions, and
Mm.
from time to time. And I can remember Gladys Carter. I interview her in my book. She said that Charity Adams came to one of the reunions and told them, "You can call me Charity." And she says, "You'll always be Major." That's
Yes.
that's the type of, you see in the movie I think, well, first of all, Kerry Washington did an outstanding performance.
Yes,
Yes.
she did.
Yes.
Yes.
And you could see, but I think that a lot of that was authentic, particularly at the end. When you see this woman that has this strong persona, this symbol of strength. She knows all of these people are subordinate to her, and she's got to lead. But she's going through a lot of opposition, from her
Mhm.
superiors. And then at the end, you see Kerry Washington actually giving them an order, and then like standing there, and then she just melts.
Mm.
She cries.
Yeah. Yeah.
Here's this human, experience. Here's this human moment, event. And then they all applaud her. And then she's moved even more because of the fact that she knows she has their support. She had their
Yes.
support, she had their respect, and that's real. That's real. But I don't know to what degree, if you're looking fast forward to 2025, that would be reenacted because of the fact we're so dispersed. We
Mm.
being African Americans, military women in the military. And I say that because of the fact that African American women are overrepresented in the Army today in 2025.
Wow.
Mm.
Yeah. Their propensity to go in is greater than any other demographic, particularly the Army. And I found that, in quantitative research that I had done. And I think about that, and their grievances today. Some of the work that I've done actually that, before doing this historical piece actually shows that I did a piece with a commander in the Navy. And we were looking at the few African-American women officers in the large survey, the NEOSH it was called, Navy Equal Opportunity Surveys. The African-American women in the Navy, the officers, didn't feel that the equal opportunity climate was what it ought to be. I mean, it came out loud and clear. And I had just published an article. And so the Navy Research and Development Center, I was a junior faculty member here. This is before 6888 book. And they saw my article in Armed Forces and Society. And they, not many people were writing about African-American women. So they asked me to come to California for the summer and research it. It was a study that, as I said, I published with a naval commander psychologist. And it was called Perceptions of Active Duty African-American Women. And it was published in Gender Issues in 1998. That came out later than 6888. But what's important is that African-American female officers in the study felt that they were subjected to negative comments and remarks because of their race.
Mm-hmm.
They further revealed that the grievance procedures were inadequate for dealing with cases of alleged discrimination. They also perceived that the Navy's distribution of rewards and punishment were racially biased against them. And they felt that a lack of networking organizations available to them impeded their professional progress. So here again, you fast forward to 2025, I don't think we've got that community of support that I noticed when I was doing research on the women during World War II.
Yeah. It sounds also like some of the same assumptions and challenges that the 6888 Battalion women were facing are still around in terms of women serving in the military, Black women serving in the military today. Are there other ways that you see the experiences of the 6888 Battalion mirrored in the experiences of Black women, whether in military leadership or other kinds of leadership roles?
Well, the 6888 was, as I said, one of many African Americans. This is a group of many African Americans, women who were serving. As I said, there were like 855, some 855 women, and there was something like 5,000 or 6,000 African American women serving in the military. So you can put that in context.
Yeah.
And many of them were leaders. Some of the women who were part of that 40, the 40 women that went into that first class, officer class, they weren't with the 6888, but you hear, nothing of them. They were leaders, in companies, commanders, because Black women in the military during World War II were officers. Many of the Black men who were in segregated unit were led by white male officers. But the African American women had African American female officers, like the 6888 is a good unit to observe because of the fact that it shows the segregation and the different rank structure within the 6888. But the leadership that you speak of is, there was, again, I think that the experiences that we're having as being uh, of racism as being less than, really speaks to this. If you remember the scene with Lena and Charity Adams, and Lena's crying and say, "I know you don't like me," what have you, and
Yes, yeah.
so you see how the leadership style is. It's like you see an empathy there. At the same time, you see a sternness. A sternness that you will straighten up. But at the same time, there's that, well, I understand, but that's not true. So it's that sort of, I don't know, uniqueness when it comes to Black leadership, especially Black women who've gone through a lot. Some of us might remember it with our own parents. I remember my mother seemed to be really tough, but at the same time, she would say, "I love you," Outside of that, you see some other leadership. I realize this person will let me fall off this cliff. if I don't watch this. Yeah, they don't give a darn about what's happening. And that's sort of hard to understand. No, this person does not care about me. They'll just go ahead and write me off. That's a difference when you find this genuine concern for the subordinates. And that's what I see, during that period, during World War II. Not only in the military, but, when I was growing up, you found that if there was a family member that was homeless, then they slept on somebody's couch. They weren't out in the cold all the time. There was a responsibility that I saw with this collective attitude during the World War II, the great generation, so to speak. My uncle was in the military, but even those who weren't in the military, what really brought them together was the sense of being Black, a Black community, and church oftentimes, So there was always this responsibility for someone. It was, it was something that wasn't legally necessary. You aren't going to be held accountable legally if you didn't assist. You definitely knew you had to do it morally because it was the ethical thing to do. It was the right thing. The terms we use is the right thing to do. And I'm a professional in a major research university. I don't say it's the right thing to do because no one's going to hear that. They want to know what's going to make them money, and so that's a whole different type of orientation, and it's something I think is grown and nurtured whenever you have really hard times externally. It's almost a necessity for survival. I think we can see it in some other groups that suffer a lot of oppression, but it's like we need to do something. If we don't do something, that person may go to the wolves. We can't allow that to happen. Well, to be fair, we're seeing some catastrophic things happen in California now, and it brings us together as a nation. People are concerned, but that race thing and what could happen to Black folk during World War II and what can happen to Black folk during 2025 without some kind of support is a scary thought. I think we have to reinstitute some of our some of those abilities to reach out and the only way I can define it, reach out and love. You know, those people are our people. Take ownership. Don't just let them fall there. And a lot of times it's not easy. But I think that it's that sort of leadership that we saw among the Black officers, among the Black non-commissioned officers, among service members during World War II. And it was that type of leadership that they came from whenever they entered from their communities. It didn't germinate in the war. They were already socialized that way. So.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to the film again. And I want to say one thing. As I'm reading your book, I think there needs to be a, what do they call a sequel, which focuses on Mary McLeod Bethune, or a prequel. There needs to be a Mary McLeod Bethune biopic because she was Oprah just made a cameo in the film, but she deserves a full treatment. I'm just going to put that out there. But what particular scenes in the film did you find emotionally effective, meaningful, and or inspirational, and why?
Well, as I said, the scene of the members of the 688 applauding Charity Adams at the end, I thought was really telling. The unity that they had, and you saw before that Charity Adams actually giving orders and then giving support and giving orders, but now it went the other way, and you find the unit. All these women are also supporting her. And so here I thought that just brought it together in a nice circle. That support went, it was reciprocal. It went both ways. So it wasn't just the Lena who's having a meltdown and didn't think that she could make it, but it's also this leader. This leader was also human. And
Yeah.
everybody understood that. They didn't try to kick her because she was having a human experience there. They supported her like they knew. They knew. We know what it's like. Yeah. And that was very, very, it was very moving to me.
Are there other stories? Michonne mentioned Mary McLeod Bethune. She wants to see a biopic. Are there other stories of Black women? And also, since you've done the book also on Japanese American women, but other stories of those women in the military that you'd like to see in a historical film or series?
Yeah, I'd like to see some of the women that I interviewed for the 6888. And some of the women I interviewed not only women for the 6888, but I interviewed African American women who went into like the first class or were in the military during World War II, like Dr. Martha Putney from Howard University. She was in the military, and she had a unit in Boston, in Massachusetts, but you don't hear of her. And she, went on to be a professor at Howard University before she deceased. I served on many of her, served on panels together years ago. Also, the late Debbie Roundtree. And you may know of her because of her
Yes.
law firm, but she was also part of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and then she was also a recruiter. And I mean, these are biographies we want to know about. There was the Judge Willie Whiting at Chicago. I interviewed her in her chambers, and she, there's just so many that is very difficult to name. But just in general, the nurses, Black nurses went overseas before
Mm.
6888 did. And they don't get very much
Oh,
attention.
yeah.
Yeah,
That would make a great series.
Yeah.
those were the first women, Black women, to go overseas,
Yeah.
or the Black nurses. After the war, Nancy-Lieutenant-Colon, who lived out at Amityville, New York, just passed away at 104. Just last week, I saw in the newspaper where
Mm.
she passed away. Was one of the first Black nurses in the regular army. So I mean, we shouldn't overlook that intersection between race and gender, because we have African American women that have done so many things that we can learn from. They exhibited strength, and a lot of that strength comes from experience. And that experience was not a cakewalk, and they had survival skills.
Directed and written by Tyler Perry and starring Kerry Washington, The 6888 is streaming on Netflix. You can purchase Professor Brenda L. Moore's book, To Serve My Country, to Serve My Race, the story of the only African American WACS stationed overseas during World War II, from our affiliate bookstore. Go to our website at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters or the podcast description for the link. Your book purchases support independent bookstores in your community, and a small commission supports the Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters podcast.
Sign up for the e-newsletter to stay up to date on new podcasts, bonus episodes, and historical drama-related resources and activities. You can find the link on the webpage as well. Subscribe to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters wherever you enjoy your favorite podcast. Leave a review. Michonne and I hope you'll give the podcast 5 stars. Follow us on Instagram at Historical Drama Sisters and on Facebook at Historical Drama Boston Sisters. Like and share Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters on your social media.
This is Michonne Boston.
And this is Tequina Boston.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast about historical films and series dramas. Visit our webpage at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters.
Tell us what historical dramas you're watching. Who knows? We may do a show about it. Sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to the podcast, and share it with the people you know who binge on historical drama.
Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters is brought to you by the Michonne Boston Group. The views and opinions expressed on Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters are those of the speakers and do not represent the positions or views of the Michonne Boston Group, its clients, or affiliates. This is Michonne Boston.
And this is Tequina Boston. Thank you for listening.